Good morning. Welcome to our Sunday morning Bible class for June 21st. We're in 2 Kings chapters 14 and 15 today. Things could really hardly be any better for Israel than we have beginning here in chapter 14. We have the reigns of, of King Amaziah of Judah in verses 1 through 22, and then Jeroboam the second of Israel in verses 23 through 29. Amaziah has a reasonably good start here in chapter 14, but then it's followed by his pride and his arrogance in verse 11. And then verses 12 and 14, he has a terrible military defeat. And then in verse 19, there's a bloody conspiracy. Then from verses 23 through the end of the chapter, we have the success of Jeroboam the second. Jehoash of Israel is one that is contemplated by Amaziah to have a battle with. This battle is going to take place in verses 8 through 14. It's going to be the Battle of Beth-shemesh. And that's going to kind of overshadow Amaziah because of the victory that is given to, that is won by Jehoash. And then we have the obituary of Jehoash appearing in verses 15 through 17. This is kind of interesting. It's his second obituary. The first was in chapter 13, verse 13. So this obituary is his second one, and it shows us that this story is told after the death of Jehoash. And then at the end of the chapter, we have Jeroboam the second. And this, of course, adds more interest to the kings of Israel than the writer has for the kings of Judah. In verses 3 and 4 of 2 Kings 14, and Amaziah did what was right in the Lord's eyes, only not like David, his father. He acted rather in line with all Joash, his father, had done. Only they did not take away the high places. So the people kept sacrificing and making offerings at the high places. Last week we discussed briefly how only 3 of the 20 kings of Judah removed those high places. In 1 Kings 15, King Asa, and then we'll find in 2 Kings 18, Hezekiah, and then in 2 Kings 22, Josiah. The only 3 kings to remove them. So when we read 1st and 2nd Kings, we find out that David is the standard for Judean kings. The Lord is seeking total devotion, and he's going to want nothing less than having a king like David. We see Amaziah in verses 5 and 6 as he wipes out those who had assassinated his father, Joash. And then in verse 7, he pulls off a tremendous victory in the battle with Edom. And then, kind of like we tell a success story and say, well, here we have in verse 8, then Amaziah sent messengers to Jehoash, son of Jehoahaz, son of Jehu, king of Israel, saying, look, let's look at each other in the face. Amaziah is really showing hostility toward Jehoash. Jehoash doesn't really want to battle Judah. So he brings out the point that Amaziah has pride. In verse 10, he says, your heart has lifted you up. But Amaziah insists on this battle with Jehoash. It occurs at Beth-shemesh. And what a terrible defeat Judah has, according to verse 12. And Amaziah was even captured, we read in verse 13. And then King Jehoash of Israel marches on down to Jerusalem, and there he breaks down 600 feet of the city wall. That would be equivalent to 2 football field lengths. So quite a large tear down of the city wall. Then he plunders the wealth of the temple of God and of the royal palace, and he takes hostages off to Samaria in verses 13 and 14. So this pride, this arrogance of Amaziah was certainly proven to be very, very foolish. In verses 15 and 22, we have two obituaries. I mentioned one of them a moment ago, Jehoash. He's given his second listing of his death here in verses 15 and 16. And then Amaziah's obituary in verses 18 through 22, it's a little more troubled. It's a little more problematic. He's the king of Judah, and he leaves Israel. He leaves Jerusalem, and we think he does that because of his complete military defeat at Beth Shemesh against Jehoash, and also because he had been captured before he became released. So he has a problem, and he decides to leave Jerusalem, and he goes down to Lachish, a town that is 30 miles or so southwest of Jerusalem. But they go and they find him. They locate him, and they assassinate him, according to verse 19. And then he's taken back to Jerusalem, verse 20, where he has a royal burial. And then Azariah, his son, becomes his successor. In the wake of these royal deaths, amazingly, things remain quite stable. In Israel, the kingdom moves slowly and smoothly from Jehoash to Jeroboam II. And in Judah, Azariah, also known as Uzziah, is confirmed as king at the age of 16. You know, when you read through 2 Kings and Chronicles, you wonder, at least I do, why people can be evil and still have success, especially those of the northern tribes of Israel. I think we have the answer in verses 26 and 27. For the Lord saw the affliction of Israel, how very bitter it was, with no helper for Israel. And the Lord had not yet spoken about wiping out the name of Israel from under heaven. So he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash. So Jeroboam is successful. He has a victory because of the mercy and the pity of God. You know, in Israel, at this point in history, they're just very close to being at the end of their time. And the chapter 13, the first 7 verses under Jehoahaz, the firstborn of Jehu, they were nearly at the end of their career then. But their glory is restored through Jeroboam II, according to 2 Kings 14, verses 23 through 29. Yet one line shows us why Jeroboam had victory. So the Lord saved them by the hand of Jeroboam. That's true today. Any success that you or I may have, any victory that we may think that is ours, it's really because the Lord has given his mercy and his blessing. When you get to 2 Kings, it seems that the writer has his finger on what we call the fast forward button. This is true from verse 1 all the way through the end of the chapter. No sooner had all those solemn speeches been given for Jeroboam's funeral in 753 BC that we are then placed on this literary roller coaster. He just rushed fast forward through the last 30 years, the final 30 years for the Northern Kingdom. 30 years, it's going to be over. And really, Israel is at the end of their history at this point, even in chapter 15. Our chapter is kind of sandwiched between two kings of Judah, Azariah in verses 1 through 7, and then the last 7 verses, his son Jotham. And in between verses 8 through 31, we have the writer just blitzing us through 5 kings of Israel. We see the certainty of the prophetic word as 2 Kings 15 begins in verses 1 through 12. Our writer doesn't seem to have as much interest in Azariah, or also translated Uzziah, because he only gets 7 verses. And really only verse 5 is not one of the normal phrases and use of words for speaking of Judean kings. Now, Chronicles gives a whole chapter to Azariah, and that's in 2 Chronicles chapter 26. I would encourage you to read that when you get a chance, because it carefully traces the great success as well as the sad pride of Azariah or Uzziah. In chapter 15 here in verse 5 of 2 Kings, we see God's judgment on Azariah. He afflicts him with leprosy. We'll talk about that a little more in just a moment. But the whole chapter of 2 Chronicles 26 is given to King Azariah. But the writer here does, in 2 Kings, does hint of the stability of Azariah, because he serves and reigns as king for 52 years, while 5 kings of Israel just are blitzed through during his reign. Verses 8, 13, 17, 23, and 27 all talk about these 5 kings of Israel during the one long reign of King Azariah. In northern Israel, just chaos and coups that took place, while one long reign was in the land of Judah. Zechariah, King Zechariah, in verse 8, takes the throne after the death of his father, Jeroboam II, that we just saw in chapter 14. And Zechariah's reign is for 6 months. Shallum conspires and assassinates King Zechariah. This brings an end to a dynasty. And verse 12 explains what I just said. It says, it was the word of the Lord which he had spoken to Jehu. This would have been in chapter 10 and verse 30, saying, your sons to the 4th generations will sit upon the throne of Israel. And that's the way it was. When the Lord promised Jehu that he would have 4 sons or 4 generations on the throne of Israel for wiping out the house of Ahab, that's exactly what happened. The Lord's word is that certain. It was true then, and it's true now. In verses 8 through 38 of 2 Kings 15, we see the signs of the coming judgment of Israel. We have both internal and external signs here in 2 Kings 16. First, we have the internal. This is a primary attention being given to the 5 Israelite kings, while the reign of 2 Judean kings sandwiched this group of 5 northern kings. And as we read in verses 8 through 31, we just see conspiracies jumping out at us. First against Zechariah in verse 10, then against Shallum in verse 14, and against Pekahiah in verse 25, and against Pekah in verse 30. We're dealing here with a 20-year history, beginning about 753 to 732 BC, in which there are 5 kings, 4 conspiracies. Israel's in a race that is leading her to extinction. Her chaos is a sign that God is in the process of destroying her. There are also external signs. The Lord's going to scourge Israel to the nation of Assyria. In verse 29, the first part says 5 northern towns were taken. And then they also took Gilead and Galilee in the second part of verse 29. So Assyria is now being dominated to the east of the Jordan, as well as to the west and to the north of the Sea of Galilee. And then at the end of verse 29, it says that the population from Galilee and Gilead were exiled to Assyria. There's great heartache and suffering with this word exiled, as we read here at the end of verse 29. There was a lot of presents and and pressure that was brought by the king of Assyria during the reign of King Menahem that we see back up in verse 19. He had such pressure on him that he had to extort from his own people silver that totaled over 37 and a half tons that he had to pay to the king of Assyria to save his own skin. But the invasion and deportation that occurs here in verse 29 under King Pekah shows Israel is only a slight push away from her extension as a nation. Verse 30 sums up 2 Kings 15 when it says, Hoshea's hands dripped with Pekah's blood. This is yet another a coup that takes place. It seems Israel has more assassins than kings in this one chapter. Israel seems to pay no attention to these preliminary signs of internal and external signs of her ruin to come. Maybe you notice, as I did, throughout this chapter, we see the tragedy of Jeroboam I in verses 9, 18, 24, and 28. These five kings that we meet in this one chapter, we find the same repeated phrase being given to them, the sins of Jeroboam. That would be the calves that he set up in the cities of Bethel and Dan at the beginning of the divided kingdom. And it appears four times in these five kings. Zechariah, verse 9, Menahem, verse 18, Pekahiah, verse 24, and Pekah, verse 28. So this phrase does not occur to King Shallum in verses 13 through 15. And the reason is he only served 1 month as king. But each of these four kings, we're told, did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam. The northern kingdom had 20 kings over their period of 200 plus years. Not a one of them ever turned away from worshiping the calves that Jeroboam had set up. 200 years passed, and this terrible thing which Jeroboam instigated still had its grip on that nation. These two chapters, 14 and 15 of 2 Kings, are really quite interesting. We have 9 kings and 5 assassinations. Of these 9 kings, 6 of them are from the northern tribes of Israel, and 3 of them are from Judah. Of the 5 assassinations, 4 of them are the northern tribes of Israel, and only 1 is from Judah. If you look at 2 Kings 14, the first chapter, first 20 verses, and also 2 Chronicles chapter 25 as a parallel passage, we see Amaziah as a very presumptuous king of Judah. He trusted God, but not wholeheartedly. And remember, he had a great victory over the nation of Edom. And then he defies God by bringing back from Edom idols. And he worshiped those idols. And the Lord tried to speak to him through his prophets, and he would not listen. And finally, it is summed up in 2 Chronicles 15, verse 16. I know that God has determined to destroy you because you have done this and have not listened to his counsel. So Amaziah, the king of Judah, challenges Jehoash to a battle because of his arrogance. And of course, he loses, and he's taken captive. And then Jerusalem is greatly damaged, as well as great amounts of wealth being taken from the temple and from the royal palace by King Jehoash. And ultimately, Amaziah is hunted down and assassinated. And then in verses 20 through 29 of 2 Kings 14, we find Jeroboam being a prosperous king of Israel. This passage, though, tells us that Jeroboam did that which was evil in the sight of God, but God had not forgotten his covenant. God saw the affliction of Israel. He was moved to do some things to help them. Even though Jeroboam did what was evil, God still used him to bring peace to Israel for a while and to restore some of the borders that had been taken away. In 2 Kings chapter 15, the first 7 verses, along with a parallel passage in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, we see Azariah as an illustrious king of Judah. Azariah is also translated as Uzziah, and he rules when his father Amaziah was captured by Israel that we spoke of in chapter 14. And he ruled alone until later his own son, Jotham, begins to rule with him. Azariah devoutly worshiped God when the prophet Zechariah was with him, but he did not remove the high places. These were places where sacrifices were made unlawfully to God rather than in the temple, and sometimes false gods were also worshipped at those high places. Uzziah was in war against the Philistines, the Arabians, and several other nations, and he became very, very powerful. He also built towers on the walls of Jerusalem, and it helped for the production of the agriculture to be greatly improved in Judah. So he had a lot of great victories, but this must have caused him to become prideful. And because of this, he decided he wanted to burn incense to the Lord himself in the temple. And then the chief priest and 80 other priests defied him, stood in his way. This incensed Azariah. And instead of admitting his sin and obeying God's law, he became very angry. And at that moment, God struck him with leprosy. Because of his leprosy, he had to live in a separate house. He was unable to have socialization with those around him. So his son Jotham reigned in his place. In 2 Kings 15, 8 through 13, we see the 5 notorious kings of Israel. The first one, Zechariah, in verses 8 through 12. Zechariah is the son of Jeroboam, and he reigned for 6 months. He did what was evil in the eyes of God, worshiping the golden calves. And then he's assassinated by Shallum. So this brings to an end the 4 generations that had been promised to the family of Jehu, and it ends with the great-great-grandson of Jehu, King Zechariah. Shallum is in verses 13 through 15. And he reigns 1 month and was assassinated by Menahem. Menahem, in verses 6 through 22, reigns 10 years. He did what was evil in the eyes of God, worshiping the golden calves. When the king of Assyria came against Israel, instead of humbly beseeching God's help, Menahem extorted from his own people silver and had to give 37.5 tons of the silver to the king of Assyria. Of course, it saved his skin, but that was about the extent of it. In verses 23 through 26, Pekahiah, the son of Menahem, reigned for 2 years, and he did what was evil in the eyes of God, worshiping the golden calves. And then he was assassinated by Pekah. This is in verses 27 through 31 that we find Pekah reigning for 20 years. He did what was evil in the eyes of God, worshiping the golden calves. Assyria captures several cities, and then he takes many of them off into captivities. And then we find Hoshea assassinates Pekah, and he ruled in his place. And Hoshea is the last king of Israel. At the end of the chapter, we have Jotham. He is a virtuous king of Judah. This is in verses 32 through 38, and also the parallel passage in 2 Chronicles chapter 27. Jotham did what was right in the eyes of God, but he did not remove the high places. So Jotham had success with the battles against the Ammonites, And this was because he ordered his ways before the Lord. Jotham became a mighty man. In these two chapters, we find a continual rebellion against the Lord God. Every now and then we see a person who seems to want to do what God wants from him, but it is not a wholehearted giving to God. We like to think that we today are a lot better than those people of the ancient world. But the truth is, we too are unrighteous. We too are corrupt and rebellious. But thankfully, we have uh, uh, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who can and will save us if we will love and obey him. Next week, we're going to look at chapters 16 and 17. Thank you.